She's just too sensitive about everything. That's what my sister Vanessa said when she brought her screaming toddler to my 30th birthday dinner at Chez Laurent, the upscale French restaurant I'd been saving for months to afford. She said it again when little Tyler knocked over my birthday cake, sending 3 tiers of vanilla buttercream cascading onto the marble floor. And she said it once more when I quietly asked her to maybe step outside with him for just a moment so the other diners could enjoy their meals in peace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But she wasn't done. Not even close. Elena, you need to understand that children come first, Vanessa announced to our entire table of 12, her voice cutting through the restaurant's gentle ambiance like a chainsaw through silk. When you have real responsibilities instead of playing house with that military boyfriend of yours, maybe you'll get it. Playing house. That's what she called my marriage to the man who'd been deployed for 8 months, serving our country while she collected unemployment checks and complained about how hard single motherhood was, despite living rent-free in our parents' basement. My mother, Patricia, nodded approvingly at Vanessa's little speech, reaching over to pat her hand. Vanessa's right, dear. You knew she was bringing Tyler when you planned this. Maybe next time choose somewhere more family-friendly. She gestured dismissively at the elegant interior I'd specifically chosen because I thought, foolishly, that my 30th birthday deserved something special. My father, Robert, just stared at his phone, occasionally grunting in agreement with whatever criticism was being lobbed my way. He'd mastered the art of being physically present but emotionally vacant, especially when it came to mediating between his daughters. The golden daughter and the disappointment. Tyler was now under the table, sticky fingers grabbing at other diners' ankles while Vanessa scrolled through her phone, completely unbothered. The couple at the table next to us had already asked to be moved. The elderly woman across the aisle kept shooting us looks that could freeze hell. Vanessa, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, Could I please just what? She snapped, looking up from her Instagram feed for the first time in 20 minutes. Be a perfect mother like you're gonna be someday? Oh wait, you're not even planning to have kids because you're too selfish, right? That's what Mom told me. The table went silent. Even Tyler stopped his under-table exploration for a moment. I looked at my mother, who suddenly found her wine glass fascinating. This was news to me. Apparently, my private conversation with Mom about wanting to wait until Jackson returned from deployment before starting our family had been twisted into some narrative about selfishness and shared with my sister as ammunition. I never said I wasn't having children, I said carefully, my hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my voice steady. I said we wanted to wait until... Until what? Until your husband gets tired of playing soldier and comes home to his real life? Vanessa's laugh was sharp and cruel. Elena, he's been gone for 8 months. If he really cared about you, he would have found a way to be here for your birthday. But here you are alone, making the rest of us pretend this fancy dinner matters when you're basically a military widow already. The words hit me like a physical blow. Military widow. As if Jackson were dead instead of serving his country. As if his sacrifice, our sacrifice, meant nothing. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I blinked them back. I'd learned long ago that crying in front of Vanessa was like pouring gasoline on a fire. She'd mock me for being too emotional and somehow make herself the victim of my tears. That's enough, I said quietly, but Vanessa was just getting started. You know what your problem is, Elena? You think you're better than us because you married some guy in uniform. But look around. She gestured at the half-empty restaurant. Half empty because her son had driven away most of the other diners. You're sitting here alone on your birthday pretending everything is fine while your husband is probably... Probably what? I asked, my voice dangerously low. Probably finding comfort somewhere else. I mean, come on, 8 months? What kind of man leaves his wife alone for 8 months unless he's got something better waiting for him overseas? My mother reached across the table and squeezed Vanessa's arm affectionately. Oh, honey, don't say that. I'm sure Elena's husband is faithful." The pause before faithful spoke volumes. My father finally looked up from his phone. "Can we just eat? I'm paying for this meal and I'd like to enjoy it." That's when it hit me. They weren't just ruining my birthday. They were systematically dismantling my marriage, my choices, my character, all while I sat there taking it like I had for 30 years. The good daughter. The understanding one. The one who never made waves, never fought back, never demanded better. Vanessa stood up abruptly, Tyler still crawling around somewhere under the table. "You know what? I think we should go. Tyler's getting fussy, and Elena's clearly not in the mood to be around family anyway." "Are you, Elena? Too good for us regular people." She didn't wait for an answer. She never did. "Come on, Tyler. We're leaving Aunt Elena's boring dinner party." She scooped up her son, who immediately started wailing, and headed for the door without so much as a happy birthday, or an apology for the destroyed cake that still decorated the restaurant floor like sweet, expensive confetti. My parents followed her, of course. They always followed her. "Happy birthday, dear," my mother said, pressing a dry kiss to my cheek. "Maybe next year plan something more realistic." And then they were gone, leaving me alone at a table set for 12, surrounded by the wreckage of what was supposed to be my celebration. My name is Elena Thorne, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been made to feel like you're asking for too much when all you wanted was basic respect on your own birthday? Have you ever had your family treat your military spouse like an inconvenience instead of a hero? Have you ever been left sitting alone, wondering if maybe they were right? Maybe you were too sensitive, too demanding, too much? Well, what my family didn't know as they walked out of Chez Laurent that night was that my absent husband wasn't actually overseas anymore, and he was about to make an entrance they'd never forget. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, staring at the birthday candles that had somehow survived Tyler's cake massacre. The waiter, a kind man named Pierre with gentle eyes and a thick French accent, had quietly cleaned up the mess without making me feel worse than I already did. "Madame," he said softly, approaching my table with a small slice of cake he'd managed to salvage from the kitchen. "Perhaps a small celebration is still possible, non?" I looked up at him, this stranger showing me more kindness than my own family had all evening, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not break. I'd been broken by them too many times to count. This was different. This was the sound of something shifting, realigning, preparing for what was coming. "Thank you," I whispered, accepting the plate. "But I think I'm done celebrating for tonight." Pierre nodded knowingly. "Family," he said, with the wisdom of someone who'd probably witnessed 1,000 restaurant dramas. "They think they know you. But sometimes, they only know the version of you that makes them comfortable." His words hit deeper than he could have known. Because that was exactly it, wasn't it? They knew Elena the peacekeeper. Elena the understanding one. Elena who would smile and nod while they tore her down, who would clean up their messes, who would accept their cruelty disguised as concern. But they didn't know Elena the Navy SEAL wife. They didn't know the woman who had learned to stand alone while her husband served overseas, who had built a life of quiet strength while they built theirs on drama and dependence. They didn't know the Elena who had been shaped by loving someone whose very existence was defined by courage, honor, and protection. And they definitely didn't know that their absent husband had been texting me throughout the entire dinner. My phone had been buzzing against my leg for the past hour, but I'd ignored it out of respect for the birthday celebration I'd hoped to have. Now, alone at my destroyed party, I finally looked at the messages. "How's the birthday dinner, beautiful? Wish I was there. Tell your family I said hello. Especially that sister of yours. Everything okay? You're not responding. Elena, answer me, what's happening? I'm tracking your location. Are you still at the restaurant? On my way. On his way. My heart started racing, but not with fear, with anticipation. Because Jackson Thorne, Lieutenant Jackson Thorne of the United States Navy SEALs, wasn't the type of man who made empty promises. When he said he was coming, he was coming. I typed back quickly, "Family left early, I'm okay, don't do anything crazy." His response was immediate. "Too late for that, sweetheart. Happy birthday." I stared at my phone, reading those 3 words over and over. Happy birthday. The only person who had said those words to me all evening with genuine warmth was my husband, who was supposedly thousands of miles away, probably finding comfort with someone else according to my sister's cruel speculation. But here's what Vanessa didn't understand about military marriages, what none of them understood. When you love someone who risks their life for strangers, you learn the difference between sacrifice and abandonment. When you're married to someone who operates in life or death situations, you learn to trust in ways that people in ordinary relationships never have to. Jackson wasn't absent by choice, he was absent by duty. And there's a world of difference between a man who leaves because he doesn't care, and a man who leaves because he cares about something bigger than himself. My family saw his deployment as proof that I didn't matter enough to keep him home. I saw it as proof that I'd married a man with the courage to serve something greater than his own comfort. They saw his silence during dangerous missions as neglect. I saw it as him keeping classified information classified, even from the woman he loved, because that's what honor looks like. They saw my solo birthday dinner as evidence that I was alone. I saw it as evidence that I was strong enough to hold down our life while he held up his duty. But what none of us saw coming, not me, not them, not even Pierre, who was probably used to family drama, was that sometimes the universe decides it's time to set the record straight. Sometimes the husband you thought was deployed in some undisclosed location is actually much closer than anyone imagined. Sometimes the man your family dismisses as playing soldier has been quietly planning something that will redefine every assumption they've made about your marriage, your worth, and your place in their little hierarchy of importance. See, here's what I'm about to tell you, and I need you to stay with me because this story is about to take a turn that even I didn't see coming. Military families live by different rules than civilian families. We understand things about loyalty, about sacrifice, about showing up when it matters most, that people like Vanessa will never comprehend. And when you disrespect a SEAL's wife on her birthday, when you mock his service and question his commitment, when you leave her sitting alone surrounded by the wreckage of what should have been her celebration, well, let's just say that's when you find out exactly what kind of man you've been talking about. My phone buzzed one more time. Look up. I raised my eyes from the screen, and that's when I saw him. Standing in the doorway of Chez Laurent, still in his dress blues, looking like he'd stepped out of a movie and into my demolished birthday party, was my husband. But this wasn't just any homecoming. This wasn't a surprise visit or a romantic gesture. This was Lieutenant Jackson Thorne, fresh from a classified mission, wearing his full naval uniform with ribbons and insignia that told stories my family would never be worthy to hear, looking around the nearly empty restaurant with the kind of calm intensity that made grown men step aside. And he was looking for answers about why his wife was sitting alone on her birthday, surrounded by cake crumbs and empty chairs where her family should have been. Have you ever seen a Navy SEAL size up a situation? Have you ever watched a man trained in tactical assessment survey a room and immediately understand exactly what went wrong and who was responsible? Because I was about to, and so was my family, whether they knew it or not. The moment Jackson stepped inside Chez Laurent, the entire atmosphere of the restaurant shifted. It wasn't just his physical presence, though at 6'3", with the kind of build that comes from years of elite military training, he certainly commanded attention. It was something deeper, something that made every conversation in the dining room pause mid-sentence. Pierre, who had been collecting empty plates from nearby tables, stopped what he was doing and straightened his posture instinctively. The hostess at the front podium smoothed her hair and stood taller. Even the soft jazz music seemed to quiet itself in deference to whatever energy had just walked through those doors. But I saw something in Jackson's eyes that the other diners couldn't see, something that made my stomach clench with a mixture of pride and apprehension. This wasn't just my husband surprising me for my birthday. This was Lieutenant Jackson Thorne conducting reconnaissance. He swept the restaurant with the methodical precision of someone trained to assess threats and gather intelligence in hostile territory. His gaze moved from table to table, noting the nervous glances of other patrons, the cake remnants still visible on the floor despite Pierre's best efforts, the single-occupied chair at what was obviously meant to be a large party table. When his eyes finally found mine, I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. In that moment, I realized he wasn't just seeing me sitting alone. He was reading the entire crime scene of my ruined birthday like a book written in a language only he could understand. "Mrs. Thorne," Pierre approached our table with the kind of careful respect you'd show to someone you instinctively knew not to underestimate. "This gentleman, he is with you?" Before I could answer, Jackson was beside me, his hand warm and familiar on my shoulder. But when he spoke to Pierre, his voice carried an authority that made the French waiter's eyes widen slightly. "Lieutenant Jackson Thorne, United States Navy," he said, extending his hand in a grip that Pierre accepted, with newfound reverence. "I apologize for arriving late to my wife's birthday celebration. I hope there haven't been any difficulties this evening." The way he said difficulties made it clear this wasn't a casual question. This was a debriefing. Pierre glanced between us, clearly understanding that he was being asked to provide intelligence about whatever had transpired before the lieutenant's arrival. Well, there was a small situation with the other guests. "What kind of situation?" Jackson's tone remained perfectly polite, but there was steel underneath the courtesy. "The family, they left early. There was some trouble with a child, and the birthday cake, it was compromised." Pierre gestured delicately toward the floor where traces of vanilla buttercream still clung to the marble despite his thorough cleaning efforts. I watched my husband process this information, his expression never changing but his hand tightening slightly on my shoulder. "I see. And my wife? She remained here alone?" "Oui, Lieutenant. She has been very gracious about the whole affair, but—" Pierre trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like an indictment. Jackson nodded once, a sharp acknowledgement that told me he'd gathered all the information he needed to understand exactly what had happened in his absence. Then he turned to me, and for the first time since walking through those doors, his military bearing softened into something that was purely my husband. "Happy birthday, beautiful," he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." "How are you here at all?" I whispered, still not quite believing he was real, and not some birthday wish manifestation. "I thought you were classified," he said with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But some things are more important than operational security, like making sure my wife doesn't spend her 30th birthday alone because her family decided to act like children." The way he said it, with that particular tone of controlled anger that I'd only heard him use when discussing enemies of the state, made me realize that my family had just crossed a line they didn't even know existed. "Jackson, it's okay, they didn't mean—" "Elena," his voice was gentle but firm, "don't make excuses for people who wouldn't make excuses for you." He pulled out the chair next to mine, Vanessa's abandoned chair, I realized with a strange sense of poetic justice, and sat down with the kind of fluid, controlled movement that spoke of countless hours of physical training and tactical preparation. "Now," he said, signaling Pierre with the subtle authority of someone accustomed to command, "I'd like to hear exactly what happened here tonight, every detail." Pierre approached with a fresh bottle of champagne that I was certain we hadn't ordered, but somehow seemed entirely appropriate given the circumstances. "Lieutenant, perhaps Madame would prefer to tell you herself?" Jackson looked at me with those storm-gray eyes that had gotten me into trouble from the moment I'd met him 3 years ago at a Navy charity gala. "Elena? Would you like to walk me through the evening's events? There was something in his tone that made me understand this wasn't just a husband asking about his wife's bad day. This was a military professional requesting a situation report from someone he trusted to provide accurate intelligence. So I told him everything. About Vanessa bringing Tyler to an upscale restaurant without any consideration for other diners. About the destroyed cake and the dismissive comments about my sensitivity. About my mother's support of Vanessa's behavior and her revelation of our private conversations. About my father's complete disengagement and financial complaints. But most importantly, I told him about Vanessa's cruel speculation about his deployment, her suggestion that he was finding comfort elsewhere, her dismissal of his service as playing soldier, and her final declaration that I was basically a military widow already. With each detail I shared, I watched my husband's expression grow more controlled, more focused, more dangerous. Not dangerous to me, never to me, but dangerous in the way that a loaded weapon becomes dangerous when pointed in the wrong direction. When I finished, the restaurant was completely quiet except for the soft classical music and the distant sounds of kitchen staff. Even Pierre had retreated to a respectful distance, though I could see him watching us with the fascination of someone witnessing something significant. Jackson was silent for a long moment, processing everything I'd told him with the methodical thoroughness that had made him one of the youngest officers ever selected for SEAL training. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "So let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," he said, and I could hear the tactical briefing tone creeping into his voice. "Your sister brought an undisciplined child to an inappropriate venue, destroyed your birthday celebration, publicly humiliated you, questioned your marriage, disrespected my service to our country, and then left you to deal with the aftermath alone. Well, when you put it like that, and your parents not only failed to intervene but actively supported this behavior, it wasn't a question. It was an assessment. Jackson, their family, they didn't mean Elena." He turned to face me fully, and I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. It was the look he got when he was about to undertake a mission that required absolute precision and zero tolerance for failure. Family doesn't treat each other the way they treated you tonight. What they did wasn't family dynamics. It was hostile action against someone under my protection. Under his protection. The phrase sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. Jackson reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like a contact list. "I'm going to remind your family about the importance of respect, accountability, and the consequences of their actions." "Jackson, please don't do anything that—" "Elena," he said gently, covering my hand with his, "trust me, have I ever let you down?" I looked at this man who had traveled thousands of miles in secret just to surprise me for my birthday, who had walked into a restaurant in full dress uniform because he wanted to honor our celebration properly, who was now sitting in the wreckage of my family's cruelty with the kind of controlled fury that spoke of deep, protective love. "No," I whispered, "you never have." "Then trust me now. Your family is about to learn something very important about the difference between playing soldier and being married to one." He stood up, that fluid, controlled movement again, and extended his hand to me. "Come on, birthday girl. We have some visits to make." The drive to my parents' house on Maple Grove Lane took exactly 12 minutes. I know because Jackson timed it the way he timed everything when he was in mission mode. We rode in his rental car, a black sedan that somehow looked more official with him behind the wheel, while he explained his plan with the kind of calm precision that made my stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. "We're not going there to start a fight," he said, checking his watch as we pulled into the familiar driveway. "We're going there to finish one." The house looked exactly the same as it had 3 hours ago when I'd left for my birthday dinner, full of hope and naive optimism. Same manicured lawn that my father obsessed over, same ceramic garden gnomes that my mother collected, same pink bicycle with training wheels that Tyler had left sprawled across the walkway like a territorial marker. Through the living room window, I could see them, all of them. Vanessa was on the couch with Tyler finally asleep in her lap, scrolling through her phone with the satisfied expression of someone who felt completely justified in her behavior. My mother was in her favorite armchair, probably recounting the evening's events to my father, with the kind of righteous indignation she reserved for situations where she felt her golden daughter had been wronged. Dad was in his recliner, beer in hand, nodding along to whatever narrative was being constructed about my unreasonable expectations. It was a perfect tableau of a family that had already rewritten history to make themselves the victims of my selfish birthday demands. "They look comfortable," Jackson observed, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant someone's comfort was about to be seriously disrupted. "Maybe we should just go home," I said, suddenly afraid of what was about to happen. "It's not worth it." Jackson turned to me, and in the dim light from the street lamp, I could see the steel in his eyes. "Elena, what they did tonight wasn't just disrespectful to you. It was disrespectful to every military family that sacrifices for this country. They made assumptions about my commitment to you, my honor, my service. That can't stand." He reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing over my wedding ring, the simple platinum band he'd given me before his last deployment. Besides, they left my wife sitting alone on her birthday surrounded by cake crumbs. That's not just personal, sweetheart. That's tactical. Before I could ask what he meant by tactical, he was out of the car and moving toward the front door with the kind of purposeful stride that made me understand why his commanding officers had fast-tracked his promotion through the ranks. I hurried to catch up, my heels clicking against the concrete walkway that had witnessed 1,000 family dramas but never anything quite like this. Jackson didn't knock. He didn't ring the doorbell. He simply opened the front door. It was never locked in my parents' neighborhood, and walked inside like he owned the place. The effect was immediate and electric. Vanessa looked up from her phone, her mouth opening in surprise, before quickly morphing into that familiar expression of annoyed superiority. "Elena? What are you doing here, and why?" Then she saw Jackson. All the words died in her throat as she took in his dress blue uniform, the ribbons across his chest, the insignia that marked him as someone considerably more significant than the military boyfriend she'd been dismissing all evening. For the first time in my memory, my sister was completely speechless. My mother's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, suspended in midair as her brain tried to process what she was seeing. This wasn't the absent husband she'd been pitying me for marrying. This was a United States naval officer in full dress uniform, standing in her living room like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster. My father's beer can crumpled slightly in his grip as he sat forward in his recliner, suddenly looking like a man who realized he might have seriously miscalculated something important. "Good evening," Jackson said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter without conscious thought. "I'm Lieutenant Jackson Thorne, United States Navy SEALs. I believe you've all been discussing my wife's birthday celebration this evening." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, Tyler's soft breathing, and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Vanessa was the first to recover, though her voice came out smaller than usual. We didn't know you were back." "No," Jackson agreed pleasantly, "you didn't. But I've been briefed on the evening's events, and I felt it was important to address some misconceptions that seemed to have developed in my absence." He moved further into the room with that controlled grace that marked all his movements, and I watched my family track him like prey animals watching a predator. None of them had ever seen Jackson in uniform before. They'd only met him once, briefly, at our wedding, where he'd been in civilian clothes and on his best family-friendly behavior. This was different. This was Lieutenant Thorne, and Lieutenant Thorne was not pleased. Misconceptions? My mother managed, setting down her wine glass with a hand that trembled slightly. "About my commitment to my wife," Jackson said, stopping directly in front of the couch where Vanessa sat with sleeping Tyler. "About my service to our country. About the priorities of a military family." He looked down at Vanessa with the kind of calm assessment that made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. I understand you suggested this evening that my deployment indicated a lack of care for Elena. That I might be finding, quote, elsewhere while serving overseas. Vanessa's face went pale. I didn't mean. You also referred to my service as playing soldier and suggested that Elena was, quote, basically a military widow because of my absence. His tone never changed, never became hostile or loud, but somehow the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jackson, my mother interjected, clearly sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere she didn't want it to go. I'm sure Vanessa didn't mean any disrespect. She was just upset about the restaurant situation and… Mrs. Caldwell, Jackson said, turning his attention to her with the same controlled intensity. With all due respect, your daughter destroyed my wife's birthday celebration, publicly humiliated her, questioned her marriage, and then left her to sit alone in a restaurant surrounded by the wreckage of what should have been a celebration of the woman I love. My father finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than usual. Now look here, son, families have disagreements and… Mr. Caldwell, Jackson interrupted smoothly, this wasn't a family disagreement. This was a targeted attack on someone under my protection, based on assumptions about military life that demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of duty, honor, and sacrifice. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope that I hadn't noticed before. I've been serving in a classified capacity for the past 8 months, which meant I couldn't share details of my location or mission timeline with anyone, including my wife. That's called operational security, and it's designed to protect both military personnel and their families. He handed the envelope to my father, who opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. I watched Dad's face change as he read whatever was inside, his expression shifting from defensive to confused to something that looked like awe. What is it? My mother asked, leaning over to see. It's a commendation, my father said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. For classified operations in… Jesus Christ. Language, Robert, my mother said automatically, but her heart wasn't in it. She was staring at Jackson like she was seeing him for the first time. I've spent the last 8 months, Jackson continued with that same calm authority, conducting operations that I can't discuss in detail but that directly impact the safety and security of American families, including yours. He looked around the room, meeting each of their eyes in turn. So when you suggest that my absence indicates a lack of commitment to my wife, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every service member who has ever missed a birthday, a holiday, or a family dinner because they were serving something larger than themselves. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably on the couch, Tyler stirring slightly in her arms. We didn't know. No, Jackson agreed, you didn't know, because you didn't ask. You made assumptions based on your own limited understanding of what military service requires. He moved closer to where I stood near the doorway, his hand finding mine with the kind of natural protectiveness that had drawn me to him from the beginning. But here's what you're going to know from now on. Elena is not a military widow. She's the wife of a Navy SEAL who would cross oceans to get home to her. She's not alone because I don't care. She's strong because she has to be when I can't be here to protect her myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Tyler seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, remaining perfectly still in Vanessa's arms. And the next time, Jackson said, his voice dropping to a tone that made everyone in the room lean forward despite themselves, anyone in this family decides to ruin her birthday, question her marriage, or leave her sitting alone because they think she doesn't deserve better treatment, they're going to have to answer to me. He looked directly at Vanessa. Is that understood? The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air, her usual sharp tongue completely paralyzed by the reality of who she'd been insulting all evening. Tyler chose that moment to wake up, blinking sleepily and looking around the room with the confused innocence of a 3-year-old who'd fallen asleep to one world and awakened to another. He took in Jackson's uniform with wide eyes, then pointed a sticky finger at the ribbons on his chest. "Mommy, is he a real soldier?" Tyler asked in that loud whisper that children think is quiet. The innocent question seemed to snap Vanessa out of her paralysis, but instead of making things better, it made everything infinitely worse. Because now she had to answer her son's question while looking at the very real soldier she'd spent the evening calling fake. Yes, Tyler, he's real." Her voice was barely audible. "Cool." Tyler scrambled off her lap and toddled over to Jackson with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. "Do you have a gun?" Under any other circumstances, the question might have been amusing. But in this moment, with the tension crackling through the room like electricity before a storm, it felt like another indictment of how completely my family had misunderstood the man they'd been dismissing. Jackson's expression softened as he looked down at Tyler, and for a moment I saw my husband instead of Lieutenant Thorne. "I do have training with weapons," he said gently, crouching down to Tyler's eye level. "But my job is to protect people, not hurt them. Do you understand?" Tyler nodded solemnly, clearly impressed. "My mommy says soldiers aren't real heroes like firefighters." The silence that followed Tyler's innocent revelation was absolutely crushing. Vanessa's face went from pale to gray to a sickly green that suggested she might actually be physically ill. Because here was her own 3-year-old son, unknowingly exposing yet another layer of the disrespect she'd been teaching him about military service. Jackson stood slowly, his movement controlled and deliberate. When he looked at Vanessa now, there was something in his expression that made me take an involuntary step closer to him. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I was suddenly afraid for her. "You've been teaching your son that soldiers aren't real heroes," he said, and his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "You've been raising him to disrespect the people who die so he can sleep safely in his bed." "I didn't. I never said," Vanessa stammered, but we all knew she was caught. Tyler's innocent honesty had exposed something ugly and unforgivable. My father shot up from his recliner so quickly that beer foam spilled onto his shirt. "Now hold on just a minute." "Sit down, Robert." The command came from my mother, but her voice was different now. Shaky. Afraid. She was staring at the commendation letter in her hands, like it contained the secrets of the universe. Do you know what this says?" Dad looked at her uncertainly but sat back down. Mom held up the letter with trembling fingers. "This is a Navy Cross citation. It's the second highest military decoration for valor in combat." She looked up at Jackson with something that might have been awe or terror. "You saved 17 Marines from enemy fire in Syria. You carried wounded soldiers through active combat zones. Oh my God." The room went so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Even Tyler seemed to sense that the adults were discussing something important, and he moved closer to his mother with the instinctive wariness of a child who knows trouble when he sees it. 17 Marines, my mother repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved 17 Marines, and Vanessa said you were playing soldier." Jackson didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, letting the weight of that revelation settle over my family like a blanket of shame. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the tactical assessment of how much damage had been done, and how much more might be necessary to ensure it never happened again. "The mission details are classified," he said finally. "What matters is that I did my job, just like thousands of other service members do their jobs every day without recognition or thanks. What matters is that while I was doing that job, my wife was here, holding down our life, supporting my service, and deserving better treatment from the people who claim to love her." Vanessa finally found her voice, though it came out as a croak. "Jackson, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never would have said those things if I'd known you were. If you had done..." If I had done what? He asked, and there was steel in his tone again. If I had proven myself worthy of your respect? If I had earned the right to be married to your sister without your approval? She flinched as if he'd slapped her. The problem, Vanessa, isn't that you didn't know about my service record. The problem is that you thought Elena deserved to be treated badly because of what you assumed about her husband's character. He moved closer to the couch, and I watched my sister shrink back into the cushions. You destroyed her birthday. You humiliated her in public. You left her sitting alone in a restaurant because you decided she wasn't worthy of basic human decency. But I didn't mean... You meant every word, Jackson cut her off. You meant it when you called her too sensitive. You meant it when you suggested I was cheating on her. You meant it when you told your son that soldiers aren't real heroes. You meant all of it, and the only thing you're sorry about now is that you got caught. Tyler started to cry, sensing the tension and hostility directed at his mother. Vanessa gathered him protectively in her arms, but for once she didn't use him as a shield against criticism. She just held him and stared at Jackson with the expression of someone who had just realized they'd been playing with a loaded gun. My father cleared his throat nervously. Son, maybe we all got off on the wrong foot tonight. Families say things they don't mean when emotions are running high. Mr. Caldwell, Jackson said, turning that laser focus on my father, with respect, this wasn't emotions running high. This was a pattern of behavior that targeted your daughter because you've decided she's acceptable collateral damage in your family's dysfunction. Dad's face flushed red. Now you listen here. No, you listen. Jackson's voice didn't get louder, but it got harder. You sat in that restaurant tonight and said nothing while your daughter was humiliated. You complained about paying for a meal while your other daughter's birthday was being destroyed. You enabled every cruel word that came out of Vanessa's mouth because it was easier than standing up for what was right. He gestured toward the commendation letter still clutched in my mother's hands. I've risked my life for strangers, Mr. Caldwell. I've carried wounded men through gunfire, because that's what honor looks like. And you can't even protect your own daughter from her sister's cruelty in a restaurant. The accusation hit home like a physical blow. My father's face went from red to ashen, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look genuinely ashamed. And you, Mrs. Caldwell, Jackson continued, his attention shifting to my mother, you sat there and validated every insult. You took private conversations Elena shared with you in confidence and turned them into ammunition for her sister to use against her. You chose sides, and you chose wrong. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the manipulative tears she usually deployed when caught in bad behavior. These were the tears of genuine remorse, of someone who had just realized the magnitude of their failure. We didn't realize, she began, but Jackson held up a hand. You didn't want to realize. There's a difference. He looked around the room at my family, my sister clutching her crying son, my parents pale and shaken, the commendation letter providing silent testimony to everything they'd gotten wrong about the man they'd dismissed. But you're going to realize it now, he said, and his voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You're going to understand that Elena isn't your emotional punching bag anymore. You're going to understand that disrespecting military families has consequences. And you're going to understand that the next time you decide to treat my wife like she's less than she is, you won't just be answering to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, checking something on the screen before looking back at them. You'll be answering to me. The threat wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. This was a Navy SEAL informing them that they had made an enemy of someone they very much did not want as an enemy. Tyler had stopped crying and was staring at Jackson with the wide-eyed fascination of a child who sensed he was in the presence of something powerful and important. Even at 3 years old, he understood authority when he saw it. Is that understood? Jackson asked again, his second repetition of the question carrying even more weight than the first. This time, they all nodded. Even Tyler, mimicking the adults around him with the instinctive wisdom of someone too young to pretend he didn't understand what was happening. Good, Jackson said, taking my hand and pulling me gently toward the door. Then I think our business here is finished. As we walked toward the exit, I could hear the silence behind us, heavy, shocked, and completely different from the comfortable family scene we'd interrupted. They weren't the same people who had been lounging in their living room 20 minutes ago, secure in their righteousness and satisfied with their treatment of me. They were people who had just learned that actions have consequences, and that sometimes those consequences come wearing dress blues and speaking with the quiet authority of someone who has faced down much more dangerous enemies than a dysfunctional family in suburban Connecticut. But as Jackson opened the front door and we stepped out into the cool night air, I realized something that made my chest tighten with a mixture of love and apprehension. This wasn't over, this was just the beginning. We drove in silence for the first few minutes, the weight of what had just happened settling between us like a third passenger. I kept stealing glances at Jackson's profile, watching the streetlights play across his face as we navigated the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood. His jaw was still tight, his hands gripped the steering wheel with the controlled tension of someone coming down from a high-stakes operation. "Pull over," I said suddenly, my voice cutting through the quiet. He looked at me with concern. "Are you okay? Do you feel sick?" "No, pull over, please." Jackson guided the car into the parking lot of Henderson Park, the same place where we'd had our first real conversation 3 years ago after that Navy charity gala. The irony wasn't lost on me, returning to the beginning while everything else was changing. He put the car in park and turned to face me, his expression shifting from Lieutenant Thorne back to my husband. "Elena, talk to me. What's going on in your head right now?" I stared out at the empty playground, the swings moving slightly in the night breeze, and tried to organize the chaos of emotions swirling through me. Pride, gratitude, fear, vindication, and something else I couldn't quite name. "I spent 30 years learning how to make myself smaller," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. 30 years of, "Don't rock the boat, Elena. Don't be so sensitive, Elena. Family comes first, Elena." Even when family meant letting Vanessa walk all over me while my parents watched and nodded approvingly. Jackson reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing over my knuckles the way he always did when he was trying to ground me. I became an expert at swallowing insults, at pretending it didn't hurt when they chose her feelings over mine every single time. When she wrecked my college graduation party by showing up drunk and starting a fight with her ex-boyfriend, I was the one who had to apologize to our relatives for, quote, creating drama. When she borrowed money from me and never paid it back, I was told to let it go, because she was going through a hard time. The memories were flowing now, years of accumulated hurt that I'd buried under layers of family loyalty and misplaced guilt. When she sabotaged my engagement party to my first fiancé by telling him lies about me having an affair, my mother actually said I should thank her because, if he believed it so easily, he wasn't the right man anyway. But when I called off the engagement because I couldn't trust him anymore, suddenly it was my fault for being, quote, too proud to work things out. Jackson's grip on my hand tightened. "You never told me about the engagement party." Because I learned not to talk about it. I learned that telling people how badly my family treated me made me look like the problem. I learned to smile and nod and take it because that's what kept the peace. I turned to look at him directly, this man who had just walked into my family's house and systematically dismantled 30 years of established dysfunction in 20 minutes. "But you saw it for what it was immediately. You didn't tell me I was being too sensitive or that family dynamics are complicated. You didn't make excuses for them or suggest I try to understand their perspective." "Because there was no excuse for what they did to you tonight," he said simply. "There was no perspective that made it acceptable." "That's what I mean," I said, feeling tears start to build behind my eyes. "You saw me being mistreated, and your immediate response was to stop it. Not to analyze it, or minimize it, or suggest ways I could handle it better. You just stopped it." I wiped at my eyes with my free hand, frustrated by the tears but unable to stop them. "Do you know what that feels like? To have someone actually defend you instead of explaining why you don't deserve to be defended?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, and I could see him processing what I was telling him, understanding perhaps for the first time the full scope of what he'd married into when he married me. "Elena," he said finally, his voice gentler than I'd heard it all evening, "that's not what love looks like. What they've been doing to you your whole life, that's not family loyalty or complicated dynamics. That's abuse. And you've been so conditioned to accept it that you think basic protection and respect are extraordinary gestures." The word abuse hit me like a physical blow. I'd never thought of it that way. Never allowed myself to use that word for what felt like normal family dysfunction. "But they never hit me," I said automatically, the defensive response I'd been trained to give my whole life. "There are lots of ways to hurt someone without raising a hand," Jackson said quietly. "What they did tonight, systematically humiliating you, dismissing your feelings, enabling destructive behavior, isolating you from support, that's emotional warfare, Elena. And you've been fighting that war alone for 30 years. I sat with that truth, feeling it settle into places in my heart that had been numb for so long, I'd forgotten they could feel anything at all. "You know what the worst part is?" I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I actually thought tonight might be different. I thought maybe, finally, at 30 years old, I could have one birthday celebration where I was the priority, where someone cared more about my happiness than about not upsetting Vanessa." "You can," Jackson said firmly. "You should, every year for the rest of your life." "But they're my family," I said, the old programming kicking in automatically. "Elena, look at me." His voice carried that command authority again, but gentler this time. "Family is supposed to protect you, not tear you down. Family is supposed to celebrate your successes, not minimize them. Family is supposed to care about your happiness, not sacrifice it for someone else's convenience." He shifted in his seat to face me more fully. "I've served with men from every background imaginable. Rich families, poor families, broken families, perfect families. And you know what the difference is between functional families and dysfunctional ones? Functional families don't have a scapegoat." "A scapegoat?" "The person who's always responsible for everyone else's problems. The person who has to apologize for other people's bad behavior. The person who gets blamed when things go wrong and ignored when things go right. The person whose needs come last because maintaining the peace is more important than protecting them." He was describing my entire life with surgical precision. "That's been your role in this family since you were probably a child, the responsible one, the understanding one. The one who absorbs all the dysfunction so everyone else can pretend they're normal." I thought about every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone event in my life, and realized he was absolutely right. I was always the one making accommodations, offering apologies, minimizing my own needs to keep everyone else comfortable. "But what they didn't count on," Jackson continued, his voice taking on that steel edge again, "is that scapegoats sometimes marry Navy SEALs who don't accept unacceptable behavior." Despite everything, I found myself smiling at that. "Is that your professional assessment, Lieutenant?" "That's my professional and personal assessment, Mrs. Thorne." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles gently. "And here's another assessment. You've spent 30 years learning how to survive their dysfunction. Now it's time to learn how to live without it." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you get to choose now. You get to decide what kind of relationship you want with them going forward, if any. You get to set boundaries and enforce consequences. You get to prioritize your own well-being instead of their comfort." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. I don't know how to do that. "Then it's a good thing you're married to someone who's trained in strategic planning and tactical implementation." His smile was soft but determined. "We're going to reprogram your normal, Elena. We're going to teach you what you deserve, and then we're going to make sure you get it." I looked at this man who had traveled across the world to surprise me for my birthday, who had walked into my family's house in full military dress uniform to defend my honor, who was now sitting in a parking lot at midnight, helping me understand that I deserved better than I had been accepting my entire life. "How did I get so lucky?" I whispered. "You didn't get lucky," he said, reaching over to cup my face in his hand. You chose well. After 30 years of being trained to accept scraps, you still had enough sense of your own worth to recognize real love when it showed up. He leaned over and kissed me, soft and sweet and full of promise. And now real love is going to teach your family what happens when they mess with someone under seal protection. What happens next? I asked. Next, we go home to our house, where no one is allowed to treat you badly, and we finish celebrating your birthday properly. His smile turned slightly predatory. And then we wait to see if your family learned their lesson tonight, or if they need additional instruction. Additional instruction? Elena, sweetheart, what happened tonight was just the opening engagement. If they think they can go back to business as usual once I deploy again, they're going to discover that Navy SEALs have very long memories and very extensive networks. He started the car again, but before pulling out of the parking lot, he turned to me one more time. Your family spent 30 years teaching you that you don't matter. I'm going to spend the rest of our lives proving them wrong. As we drove toward our own home, our own space where I was valued and protected and celebrated, I realized something profound had shifted inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what my family might do or say or think. I was curious about what my husband would do if they tried it again. And part of me hoped they would be stupid enough to find out. 3 days passed in blissful silence. 3 days of no phone calls, no unexpected visits, no dramatic text messages demanding explanations or apologies. It was the longest my family had gone without contact since I'd gotten married, and I found myself existing in a state of peaceful suspension, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jackson had extended his leave by a week, pulling strings I didn't fully understand but was grateful for nonetheless. We spent those days doing simple, perfect things: sleeping in, making breakfast together, taking long walks around our neighborhood where no one questioned my worth or treated me like collateral damage in their personal drama. On Thursday morning, I was in our kitchen making coffee when I heard Jackson's phone ring in the living room. His ringtone was different from mine, a sharp, military standard sound that meant business rather than casual conversation. I heard him answer with his crisp, professional voice. "Lieutenant Thorne." There was a pause then. "Yes, sir, I understand. When do you need me back?" My stomach dropped. He was being recalled. Our perfect week was about to end, and I'd have to face whatever my family's next move would be without him. But then I heard something that made me freeze with my coffee cup halfway to my lips. "Actually, sir, I have a situation here that might require some additional time to resolve. It's a matter of operational security. No, sir, not international, domestic. Family-related security concerns for military personnel." I crept closer to the living room doorway, not quite eavesdropping but definitely listening with intense curiosity. "Yes, sir, I believe it could set a precedent for how we handle civilian harassment of military families." "I understand, sir. I'll submit a full report." "Thank you, sir." When he hung up, I found him staring at his phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was the look he got when he was solving a particularly complex tactical problem. "Everything okay?" I asked, settling onto the couch beside him. "Define okay," he said, pulling me against his side with one arm while scrolling through his contacts with the other. "My commanding officer just gave me another 2 weeks of leave to quote, resolve domestic security issues." Domestic security issues? "I may have suggested to him that your family's behavior toward a military spouse could be part of a broader pattern that the Navy needs to address proactively." His smile was sharp and focused. He was very interested in my assessment. Before I could ask what that meant, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted to something that made my pulse quicken. "What is it?" "Your mother wants to have lunch today. She says she'd like to clear the air and discuss moving forward as a family." He showed me the screen. "She suggested Belmont Country Club at noon." I felt that familiar clench of anxiety in my stomach. She never invites me to Belmont, That's where she goes with her bridge club friends to impress them. Exactly, Jackson said, standing up with the fluid movement that always signaled he was shifting into operational mode. She's chosen a public venue where she feels she has social advantage and you're more likely to be compliant. It's a power play. So what do? We accept her invitation, he said, already moving toward our bedroom, but we accept it on our terms. An hour later, I found myself sitting in the passenger seat of Jackson's rental car, watching him adjust his uniform in the rearview mirror. Not his dress blues this time. His service dress khakis, the everyday uniform that somehow looked even more official in broad daylight. Are you sure about this? I asked, smoothing down my own outfit. I'd chosen a navy blue dress that Jackson had bought me for a Navy Wives event. Sophisticated, appropriate, and subtly matching his uniform in a way that would signal unity to anyone paying attention. Elena, your mother chose this venue because she thinks she can control the narrative in front of her social circle. She wants to position herself as the reasonable family matriarch, trying to reconcile with her difficult daughter and her husband. He turned to look at me directly. What she's about to discover is that her social circle includes 3 retired Navy officers, 2 Marine Corps veterans, and the wife of an Army colonel. How do you know that? Because I called ahead and spoke to the club's membership coordinator, former Petty Officer Martinez. We served together before he transitioned to civilian life. His smile was predatory. He was very helpful in providing me with background on the membership demographics. We walked into Belmont Country Club at exactly 12 o'clock, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied family encounters. But this time, Jackson's presence beside me created a buffer of confidence I'd never experienced before. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, looked up from her reservation book with practiced politeness that faltered slightly when she took in Jackson's uniform. "Good afternoon. We're here to meet Patricia Caldwell," I said. "Of course, Mrs." She was looking at Jackson's name tape, clearly trying to process the connection. "Mrs. Thorne," I said, and felt a surge of pride at using my married name in this space where I'd always been introduced as Patricia's younger daughter. "Right this way, please." As we followed her through the dining room, I noticed heads turning. Not the casual curiosity of people watching new arrivals, but the focused attention that a military uniform commands in civilian spaces. I saw an elderly man in a navy blazer straighten slightly in his chair, his eyes tracking Jackson's ribbons and insignia with professional interest. My mother was seated at her usual table by the windows, looking perfectly composed in her cream-colored suit and pearl necklace. She'd positioned herself strategically, back to the wall, facing the room, able to see who was watching and who might overhear. When she saw us approaching, her expression flickered through several emotions before settling on carefully controlled politeness. "Elena, Jackson, thank you for coming." Jackson pulled out my chair before taking his own, a gesture that was both gentlemanly and tactical, positioning himself where he could see the entire room while keeping me protected by his presence. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said formally, "thank you for the invitation." "Please, call me Patricia," she said, though her voice was strained. "We're family, after all." "Are we?" The question came from me, surprising all 3 of us. But something about being in this space, with Jackson beside me and other military personnel watching from across the room, had activated a backbone I didn't know I possessed. My mother's smile faltered. "Elena, that's exactly the kind of attitude that caused problems the other night. I hoped we could discuss this like adults." "Mrs. Caldwell," Jackson interjected smoothly, "I think what Elena is asking is whether the family dynamic that led to her birthday celebration being destroyed represents the kind of relationship she wants to continue participating in." "Now see here," my mother began, but Jackson continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Because from a tactical perspective, what happened Monday night wasn't a family disagreement. It was a coordinated attack on a military spouse by individuals who should have been providing support and protection." His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the kind of authority that made other conversations in our immediate vicinity pause slightly. I've been reviewing the situation with my commanding officer, he continued, and I saw my mother's eyes widen with alarm. The Navy takes harassment of military families very seriously, particularly when it involves undermining spousal support systems during deployment periods. Harassment? My mother repeated, her voice pitched higher than usual. We weren't harassing anyone, we were having a family dinner that got a little heated. You enabled your daughter to destroy my wife's birthday celebration, publicly humiliate her, question her marriage, and abandon her in a restaurant, Jackson said calmly. In military terminology, that's called a coordinated psychological operation against friendly personnel. I noticed that the elderly man in the navy blazer had moved to a table closer to ours, ostensibly to get a better view of the golf course, but clearly listening to our conversation with growing interest. Furthermore, Jackson continued, his voice remaining conversationally level but somehow carrying more weight, teaching a 3-year-old child that soldiers aren't real heroes constitutes anti-military propaganda within a military family structure. That's not what Vanessa meant, my mother protested, but she was starting to look genuinely frightened. Mrs. Caldwell, I've been trained to assess threats and neutralize them before they can cause operational damage, Jackson said, leaning forward slightly. Your family represents an ongoing threat to my wife's psychological well-being and, by extension, to military family stability. The man in the navy blazer was now openly watching our table, and I could see him making subtle gestures to other patrons who were also paying attention to our conversation. What are you saying? My mother whispered. I'm saying that Elena deserves better than she's been getting from this family. And I'm saying that if you want to maintain any kind of relationship with her going forward, you're going to need to demonstrate that you understand the difference between family dynamics and family abuse. The word abuse landed like a bomb in the refined atmosphere of Belmont Country Club. My mother looked around nervously, clearly aware that we were now the center of attention for several tables of people she was desperate to impress. You can't just cut us out of her life, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm not cutting you out of anything, Jackson replied calmly. Elena will make that decision. But I am establishing parameters for future interactions that prioritize her well-being over your comfort. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, placing it on the table between them like a contract. These are the conditions under which Elena will consider maintaining family contact. I suggest you review them carefully with Vanessa and your husband before making any decisions about how you want to proceed. My mother stared at the paper as if it might explode. Conditions? Boundaries, I said, finding my voice again. Things like no public humiliation, no enabling destructive behavior, no using my private conversations as ammunition, no teaching children to disrespect military service. Basic human decency, Jackson added helpfully, the kind of treatment Elena should have been receiving all along. The silence that followed was profound. My mother sat frozen, the paper untouched in front of her, while the weight of 30 years of family dysfunction crystallized into a simple choice: change or lose me entirely. Finally, she reached for the paper with shaking hands. I'll discuss this with your father and Vanessa, she said quietly. You do that, Jackson said, standing and helping me to my feet. And Mrs. Caldwell, the next time you want to meet with Elena, you'll schedule it through me first. I'm her primary security now, and I take that responsibility very seriously. As we walked out of Belmont Country Club, I could feel dozens of eyes following us, but for the first time in my life, the attention felt respectful rather than judgmental. In the parking lot, I turned to my husband with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. Did you just militarize my family therapy? Sweetheart, he said, opening my car door with a satisfied smile, I just gave your family a chance to learn what healthy relationships look like. Whether they take it or not is up to them. And if they don't? His smile turned dangerous. Then they'll discover what happens when you declare war on a Navy SEAL's wife. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Jackson was already up, sitting on the edge of the bed in his PT gear, scrolling through what appeared to be dozens of notifications on his own device. "What's happening?" I asked, grabbing my phone with bleary eyes. "We're apparently famous," he said, showing me his screen. "Remember the elderly gentleman in the navy blazer at the country club yesterday?" I nodded, still trying to process the flood of messages. Retired Admiral Thomas Hartley. He posted about our conversation on the Veterans of Foreign Wars Facebook page at 11 p.m. last night. My blood went cold. Posted what exactly? Jackson handed me his phone, and I read the post that had apparently been shared over 300 times in the past 8 hours. Witnessed something remarkable at Belmont Country Club today. Young Navy SEAL having to explain to his wife's family why military spouses deserve basic respect and dignity. The composure and professionalism this officer displayed while defending his wife from family harassment was textbook leadership. His wife sat with quiet grace while her mother learned what boundaries look like. This is what honor in civilian life looks like. Proud to have served with men like Lieutenant Thorne. Semper Fi to all our brothers and sisters who protect family as fiercely as they protect country. The comments below were overwhelming. Hundreds of veterans, active duty personnel, and military spouses sharing their own stories of family dysfunction and spousal support. But what made my hands shake was seeing my own name in several of the responses. "Elena Thorne is a credit to Navy wives everywhere," one comment read, "standing up to family abuse while supporting her husband's service." Another, "That kind of family behavior is exactly why we need stronger support systems for military spouses. Thank God she married someone who knows how to fight for her." Jackson, this is... I scrolled through comment after comment of support, validation, and shared experiences. "This is insane." "It gets better," he said, pulling up another notification. "Channel 8 News wants to interview us about military family dynamics. The Navy Wives Association called to ask if you'd speak at their monthly meeting. And 3 different military blogs want to publish our story." My phone rang in my hands, displaying a number I didn't recognize. Before I could decide whether to answer, Jackson gently took it from me. "Lieutenant Thorne speaking. Yes, ma'am, this is regarding yesterday's incident. No comment at this time, but I can transfer you to our public affairs coordinator if you need official Navy response. Thank you." He hung up and looked at me with an expression that was part pride, part concern. That was the Washington Post. They want to do a feature on military families and civilian support systems. The Washington Post? My voice came out as a squeak. "Elena, what happened yesterday wasn't just about setting boundaries with your family. Whether we intended it or not, we became representatives of something bigger. Military families dealing with toxic civilian relatives. The isolation that comes with marrying into service. The way some people dismiss military sacrifice until they're forced to confront it directly." He stood up and began pacing, his tactical mind clearly working through the implications. "Admiral Hartley has 4,000 followers on that veterans page. His post has been shared into military spouse groups, veteran organizations, and family support networks across the country." My phone buzzed with another text, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "Saw the post about your husband defending you. My brother-in-law calls my Marine husband a weekend warrior and tells me I'm being dramatic about deployments. Thank you for showing me that I don't have to accept that. Sarah, Camp Pendleton." Then another, "Your story gave me courage to finally stand up to my mother-in-law, who says Army wives signed up for the loneliness and should stop complaining. You're an inspiration. Jennifer, Fort Bragg." "Jackson," I whispered, staring at these messages from women I'd never met who were finding strength in our story. "What have we done?" "We've accidentally started a movement," he said, sitting back down beside me, "and now we get to decide what to do with it." Before I could respond, our doorbell rang. Jackson moved to the window with the automatic caution of someone trained to assess potential threats, then relaxed slightly. "It's a flower delivery truck," he said. but his tone suggested this wasn't a normal flower delivery. 20 minutes later, our living room looked like a botanical garden, arrangements from military wives groups in 12 different states, bouquets from veteran organizations, a massive display from the crew of the USS Theodore Roosevelt with a card that read, "To Elena and Lieutenant Thorne, thank you for showing us what having our six looks like on the home front." But the arrangement that made me cry was the smallest one, a simple bouquet of white roses with a card that said, "From the military brats who grew up watching our parents serve and sacrifice. Thank you for showing us we don't have to accept toxic family behavior. You've given us permission to demand better." The Military Child Life Network. "I can't believe this," I said, reading card after card from people whose lives had somehow been touched by our confrontation with my mother. "We were just trying to set boundaries with my family. And in doing so, you gave thousands of other military families permission to do the same thing," Jackson said, answering his phone as it rang again. "Lieutenant Thorne." "Yes, sir, I've seen the response. I understand, sir. We'll be prepared for that." When he hung up, his expression was serious. "That was my commanding officer. The story has reached Pentagon level. The Secretary of the Navy wants to meet with us next week to discuss military family support initiatives." The Secretary of the Navy wants to meet with us? The military has been struggling with family support issues for years. Spousal isolation, toxic family dynamics, the psychological impact of deployments on family relationships. What happened yesterday accidentally highlighted problems the Navy has been trying to address through official channels for decades. He pulled up another notification on his phone. And this morning, 3 different news outlets have called the base asking for comment on the Lieutenant Thorne incident and its implications for military family policy. My phone buzzed with yet another call. This time I recognized the number, and my stomach dropped. "It's Vanessa," I said. Jackson looked at the screen, then at me. "Answer it. Let's hear what she has to say now that the whole situation has gone public." I accepted the call with shaking hands. "Hello, Vanessa." "Elena, what the hell is going on?" Her voice was shrill with panic. "Mom is getting calls from reporters asking about military family dynamics and toxic relatives. Someone from Channel 8 showed up at her house this morning asking for comment about family harassment of service members." "I don't know what you want me to say about that," I replied, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "You need to call them off. Tell them this was all a misunderstanding. Tell them we weren't harassing anyone." "But you were harassing me," I said simply. "That's exactly what you were doing." "Elena, please. This is making our whole family look bad. Mom is humiliated. Dad is furious. Tyler's preschool teacher asked me about the news story. This needs to stop." Jackson gestured for the phone, and I handed it to him without hesitation. "Vanessa, this is Lieutenant Thorne," he said with that calm authority that had become so familiar. "I want to make something very clear to you. Your sister didn't create this situation. You did. When you destroyed her birthday, humiliated her publicly, and disrespected military service, you created the circumstances that led to this outcome." There was silence on the other end then, but we never meant for it to become this big deal. "Intent doesn't matter when the damage is done," Jackson replied. "What matters now is whether your family chooses to learn from this experience or continues to blame Elena for the consequences of your own actions." "What do you want from us?" Vanessa's voice was small now, defeated. "I want you to read the conditions I gave your mother yesterday. I want you to understand that your behavior toward Elena affects not just her, but me, and by extension, my ability to serve effectively. I want you to recognize that military families face unique challenges, and the last thing we need is additional stress from people who should be providing support." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of absolute finality. "And I want you to understand that this story is now bigger than our personal family drama. Elena has accidentally become a voice for military spouses who've been dealing with toxic family dynamics for years. That's not a responsibility she asked for, but it's one she's willing to accept if it helps other families. "So what happens now?" Vanessa asked. "Now you decide," Jackson said. "You can choose to be part of the solution by examining your own behavior and making genuine changes. Or you can continue to be part of the problem and deal with the consequences of that choice in a very public forum." He ended the call and looked at me with an expression that was part pride, part amazement. "Elena, in less than 24 hours, you've gone from being your family's scapegoat to being a national spokesperson for military family rights." "I don't know how to be a national spokesperson for anything," I said, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. "You don't have to know how," he said, pulling me into his arms. "You just have to be yourself. You just have to keep being the woman who survived 30 years of family dysfunction and still had enough self-worth left to recognize real love when it showed up." Our doorbell rang again, and this time Jackson's expression was more alert. "That's not a delivery truck," he said, moving to the window. "That's a news van." I looked out to see a reporter and cameraman setting up on our front lawn, with what appeared to be neighbors gathering at a respectful distance to watch the proceedings. "Ready for this?" Jackson asked, straightening his uniform shirt. I looked around our living room filled with flowers from strangers who'd found hope in our story, at my phone still buzzing with messages from military families sharing their own experiences, at my husband who'd turned my personal family dysfunction into a platform for positive change. "No," I said honestly, "but let's do it anyway. Because sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never planned to fight." The news interview lasted 20 minutes, but by evening the clip had been viewed over 2 million times across various social media platforms. I watched myself on the local news, sitting beside Jackson on our front porch, speaking calmly about military family dynamics, while he provided context about spousal support systems during deployments. "We never intended for this to become a public conversation," I heard myself saying on the recording. "We just wanted my family to understand that military spouses deserve the same respect and consideration as anyone else." The reporter had been respectful, focusing on the broader issues rather than the specific details of our family drama. But the story's impact was immediate and devastating for my parents and Vanessa in ways I hadn't anticipated. By 9 p.m., my phone was ringing again. This time it was my father, and his voice was strained in a way I'd never heard before. "Elena, we need to talk, all of us. Tonight." "Dad, it's late and—" "Please." The word came out broken, desperate. "Your mother she's not handling this well. Vanessa is— Elena, please. We need to fix this." I looked at Jackson, who had been monitoring social media responses on his laptop. He nodded slightly, understanding passing between us without words. "We'll be there in an hour," I said. When we arrived at my parents' house, the scene was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in our family's history. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a box of tissues, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. Her bridge club friends had been calling all day, some offering support, but most asking pointed questions about the military family situation they'd heard about on the news. Vanessa was pacing the living room like a caged animal, Tyler mercifully asleep upstairs, while my father sat in his recliner looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Sit down," Dad said when he saw us. But it wasn't the commanding tone he'd used my entire life. It was a request, maybe even a plea. "Elena," my mother began, her voice wobbling, "Mrs. Henderson from the Bridge Club called to ask if I was the mother in the military family harassment story. The president of the Garden Society wanted to know if our family had, quote, unresolved issues with military support. Even Pastor Williams called to check on our family crisis situation." She wiped her eyes with a tissue that was already damp. "Everyone in town is talking about how we treated you, and they're asking questions I don't know how to answer." Vanessa stopped pacing and turned to face us. "Do you have any idea what this has done to my life?" Tyler's preschool teacher pulled me aside to ask if I needed family counseling resources. My unemployment caseworker saw the story and asked if my, quote, family stress situation was affecting my job search. The other mothers at the playground are looking at me like I'm some kind of monster. And you don't like that feeling, Jackson observed quietly. Of course I don't like it, Vanessa snapped, then seemed to remember who she was talking to and modulated her tone. I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did happen, I said, finding my voice in this strange new family dynamic where I wasn't automatically the problem. It happened because of choices you made. Elena, please, my father interjected. We know we made mistakes, we know we handled Monday night badly, but this public humiliation, isn't this going too far? Jackson leaned forward slightly, his posture respectful but unmistakably authoritative. Mr. Caldwell, let me ask you something. How do you think Elena felt when Vanessa destroyed her birthday celebration in front of a restaurant full of strangers? How do you think she felt when you all walked out and left her sitting alone surrounded by cake on the floor? That's different, my father said weakly. How is it different? Jackson asked. Because the audience was smaller? Because the people watching weren't your friends and neighbors? My mother looked up from her tissues. We didn't realize how bad it looked from the outside. It looked bad because it was bad, I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected. It looked like a family ganging up on one person because that's exactly what it was. But we're family, Vanessa said, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. Families fight. Families have disagreements. That doesn't mean we don't love each other. Vanessa, Jackson said, his tone gentler than I'd heard him use with my family before. There's a difference between family disagreements and family abuse. What happened Monday night wasn't a disagreement. It was a coordinated attack on Elena's self-worth, followed by abandonment when she needed support. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to something, then showed it to them. This is one of about 50 messages Elena received today from military spouses sharing their own stories of family dysfunction. Do you want to know what they all have in common? No one answered, but they were all listening. They all described the same pattern: one family member consistently being blamed for everyone else's problems. One person always having to apologize for other people's behavior. One person whose needs come last because keeping the peace is more important than protecting them. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each of them. That person is always Elena in your family dynamic. And that's not love, that's scapegoating. We never called her names, my father said defensively. We never hit her or anything like that. Mr. Caldwell, emotional abuse doesn't require physical violence, Jackson replied. It just requires a consistent pattern of making someone feel worthless, unwanted, and responsible for everyone else's emotional well-being. The silence that followed was profound. I watched my family process this assessment, saw them mentally reviewing 30 years of family interactions through this new lens. What do you want from us? My mother finally asked, and her voice was small and broken. I looked at these people who had shaped my understanding of family, who had taught me to make myself smaller to accommodate their dysfunction, who were now sitting in their own living room like defendants awaiting sentencing. I want you to understand that what happened Monday night was wrong, I said. Not a misunderstanding, not a family disagreement gone too far, but fundamentally wrong behavior towards someone you claim to love. We do love you, Vanessa said, and for the first time there were tears in her eyes. Then show me, I replied. Stop treating love like a feeling you have, and start treating it like actions you take. Jackson reached into his jacket and pulled out another folded paper, placing it on the coffee table between us. These are the conditions Elena mentioned. They're not punishments. They're boundaries that will allow her to have a relationship with you while protecting her emotional well-being. My father picked up the paper and began reading aloud. No public humiliation or criticism of Elena or her marriage. No enabling or excusing destructive behavior from any family member. No using Elena's private conversations as ammunition in family conflicts. No teaching children to disrespect military service or sacrifice. He continued, Family gatherings will be scheduled in advance with Elena's input on venue and activities. Tyler's behavior must be managed appropriately for the setting and other people present. Elena's boundaries and decisions will be respected without argument or guilt manipulation. And if we can't agree to these? Vanessa asked. Then you lose access to Elena entirely, Jackson said simply. She'll have a family that consists of me, my military brothers and sisters, and the community we've built around people who understand respect and loyalty. You can't just take our daughter away from us, my mother said, but there was no anger in it anymore, just desperate sadness. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm not taking anyone away, Jackson replied. Elena is choosing whether to stay in a relationship that harms her or prioritize her own well-being. What happens next depends entirely on whether you can learn to treat her the way she deserves to be treated. Tyler's voice drifted down from upstairs, calling for his mother. Vanessa looked toward the stairs, then back at us, then at the conditions document in my father's hands. Those boundaries, she said quietly, they're not just about Elena, are they? They're about Tyler, too. About what kind of family environment I'm creating for him. Children learn what they live, Jackson confirmed. If Tyler grows up watching his mother enable dysfunction and scapegoat family members, he'll either become someone who does the same thing, or someone who lets it be done to him. Like Elena did, my mother whispered, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes for the first time, like we taught Elena to do. But it's not too late to change the pattern, I said, and I realized I meant it. It's not too late to show Tyler what healthy family relationships look like. It's not too late to show me that you can choose to do better. My father set down the conditions document and looked at me directly. What if we try to follow these boundaries but we make mistakes? What if we slip back into old patterns? Then we address it when it happens, Jackson said. But the difference is that Elena won't be the one responsible for managing your behavior or fixing your mistakes. You'll be responsible for recognizing when you're causing harm and correcting it yourself. And if we can't? Vanessa asked. Then you'll lose the privilege of being in Elena's life, Jackson said with finality. Because being family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to love someone well, consistently, and without conditions. The room fell silent again as my family absorbed the reality of their situation. They were no longer in control of the narrative. They were no longer able to dismiss my needs or treat my boundaries as suggestions. For the first time in my life, they needed something from me more than I needed something from them. And the power balance that had defined our family for 30 years had completely reversed. We'll try, my mother said finally, her voice barely audible. We'll try to do better. Trying isn't enough anymore, I said gently. Either you do better or you don't. Either you choose to respect these boundaries, or you choose to lose me. But you don't get to try and fail and expect me to keep absorbing the damage while you figure it out. It was the strongest statement I'd ever made to my family, and the most liberating thing I'd ever said in my life. Because finally, after 30 years, I wasn't asking for better treatment. I was requiring it. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the waiting room of the Pentagon, wearing my best Navy suit and trying not to hyperventilate. The meeting with the Secretary of the Navy had been scheduled for 2 p.m., and at 1:45, I still couldn't quite believe this was my life now. Jackson sat beside me in his dress blues, radiating the kind of calm confidence that came from being comfortable in high-stakes situations. For him, briefing senior officials was part of the job. For me, it felt like stepping into an alternate universe, where my family dysfunction had somehow become a matter of national security. Remember, he said quietly, his hand finding mine, you're not here as the victim of family abuse. You're here as the voice of thousands of military spouses who've been dealing with similar situations in silence. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I'm not articulate enough to represent? Elena, his voice carried that gentle authority that always grounded me. You've already represented them perfectly. Just by refusing to accept unacceptable behavior. Just by setting boundaries and enforcing them. just by showing other military families that they don't have to choose between loving their service member and protecting themselves from toxic relatives. A lad aide approached us with the kind of respectful efficiency that characterized everything in this building. "Lieutenant and Mrs. Thorne, the secretary will see you now." The office was impressive but not intimidating, designed to convey authority without overwhelming visitors. Secretary Martinez was a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who had navigated military hierarchy successfully while maintaining her humanity. "Lieutenant Thorne, Mrs. Thorne, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for us to sit in the chairs across from her desk. "I've been following your story with great interest." "Thank you for taking the time to meet with us, Madam Secretary," Jackson replied formally. "Let me be direct," Secretary Martinez said, settling into her chair with the posture of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucracy to reach solutions. "The military has a spousal support problem. We've known it for years, but we've been treating it as a benefits and services issue. More counseling, more family support groups, more deployment resources." She pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be a lengthy document. "What your situation highlighted is that sometimes the problem isn't lack of military support. Sometimes the problem is active undermining from civilian family members who don't understand or respect military sacrifice." "That's exactly what we experienced," I said, finding my voice in this surreal conversation. "It wasn't that we lacked support from the Navy community. It was that my family was actively working against the stability of our marriage." "And according to the response to your story, you're not alone," Secretary Martinez continued. "We've received over 3,000 emails in the past 2 weeks from military families dealing with similar situations. Parents who undermine deployments by suggesting their children's spouses are cheating. Siblings who mock military service and create family drama around military commitments. In-laws who treat military families as second-class relatives because they don't understand the importance of the mission." Jackson leaned forward slightly. "Madam Secretary, in my experience, family dysfunction can be as operationally damaging as any external threat. A service member who's worried about their spouse being psychologically attacked by their own family can't focus fully on mission requirements." "Exactly," she said, and I heard genuine frustration in her voice. "We train our people to handle combat stress, deployment separation, and physical danger. But we don't train them to handle family members who treat their service as an inconvenience and their spouses as acceptable casualties." She turned to me directly. "Mrs. Thorne, tell me about the moment you realized you had the right to require better treatment from your family." The question caught me off guard. I'd been prepared to discuss policy recommendations or support program ideas, not to examine my own psychological journey. "It was when Jackson walked into that restaurant in his uniform," I said slowly, working through the memory. "Not because he was there to rescue me, but because I realized I was married to someone who saw my mistreatment as unacceptable. Someone who wouldn't make excuses for it or suggest I try to understand their perspective. And before that? Before that, I thought family love meant accepting whatever treatment they gave me. I thought setting boundaries was selfish. I thought asking for respect was asking for too much." Secretary Martinez nodded. "That's what we're hearing from hundreds of military spouses. They've been conditioned to believe that military families should be grateful for any civilian support, even if that support comes with emotional abuse attached." She stood up and moved to a wall display showing deployment statistics and family support metrics. "Lieutenant Thorne, your wife's story has done something our official programs haven't been able to accomplish. It's given military families permission to expect the same respect from their civilian relatives that they give to their military service." "Permission," I repeated, testing the word. That's exactly what it felt like I needed permission to value myself enough to demand basic human decency. "And that," Secretary Martinez said, turning back to face us, "is why I wanted to meet with you. Because we need to institutionalize that permission. We need military families to understand that toxic civilian relationships are a readiness issue, not a personal problem they need to suffer through silently." Jackson straightened in his chair. "What are you proposing, ma'am?" I'm proposing that we develop a comprehensive family resilience program that addresses civilian family dysfunction as seriously as we address combat stress. Training for military personnel on how to protect their spouses from toxic family dynamics. Resources for military spouses on boundary setting and relationship management. And most importantly, official recognition that choosing to limit contact with abusive relatives is not a failure of family loyalty. It's an act of family protection. The scope of what she was describing was staggering. You're talking about changing military culture around family relationships, I said. I'm talking about acknowledging reality, she corrected. The reality that military families face unique pressures that civilian families don't understand and often don't respect. The reality that a service member's effectiveness can be compromised by family drama just as surely as by physical injury. The reality that military spouses deserve protection from all threats to their well-being, including the ones that come from people who share their DNA. She returned to her desk and pulled out a formal-looking document. Mrs. Thorne, I'd like to ask you to serve as a civilian consultant on this initiative. Your experience, combined with your husband's military expertise, could help us develop programs that actually address the problems military families face instead of the problems we think they should face. You want me to help design military family policy? I want you to help us understand that military family strength isn't just about surviving deployments and relocations. It's about creating relationships that support military service instead of undermining it. It's about teaching military families that they have the right to expect respect from the people who claim to love them. I looked at Jackson, who was watching this conversation with the focused attention of someone recognizing a moment of historic importance. What would that involve? I asked. Traveling to military bases to speak with spouse groups about boundary setting and family resilience. Helping develop training materials for family support programs. Consulting on policy recommendations for addressing civilian family harassment of military personnel. She paused, and her expression became more personal. Mrs. Thorne, you've accidentally become a symbol of military spousal empowerment. The question is whether you're willing to turn that symbol into a system that can help other families before they reach the crisis point you experienced. The weight of the responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the opportunity. If I can help other military spouses avoid what I went through, or give them tools to address it more effectively, then yes, absolutely yes. Outstanding, Secretary Martinez said, extending her hand to shake mine. Welcome to the team, Mrs. Thorne. As we left the Pentagon an hour later, after discussing implementation timelines and program structures, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of what had happened to us. Jackson, I said as we walked toward the parking garage, 6 months ago I was sitting alone in a restaurant crying over destroyed birthday cake. Today I just agreed to help design military family policy for the United States Navy. Elena, he said, stopping to face me in the middle of the parking garage, 6 months ago you were a woman who had been conditioned to accept unacceptable treatment. Today you're a woman who's going to teach thousands of other military families that they deserve better. How did we get here? We got here because you finally chose yourself, he said, pulling me into his arms. You chose to marry someone who would protect you, instead of someone who would enable your family's dysfunction. You chose to set boundaries instead of absorbing abuse. You chose to see your worth instead of accepting their definition of your value. He was right. Every step of this journey had been about choices. The choice to marry a man who valued honor and protection. The choice to require respect instead of begging for it. The choice to use our personal pain to help other families avoid similar suffering. And now? I asked. Now we go home to our house, where no one is allowed to treat you badly, and we start planning how to help other military families build the same kind of protective boundaries we've built. As we drove away from the Pentagon, I realized that my family's cruelty hadn't just been overcome, it had been transformed into purpose. Their dysfunction hadn't just been healed, it had been converted into a mission that could strengthen military families across the country. It was the most complete victory I could have imagined, because it meant that even their worst behavior had ultimately served something good. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly free from the power they'd held over my sense of worth. Not because I'd defeated them, but because I'd outgrown the need for their validation entirely. 3 months after the Pentagon meeting, I was in my home office reviewing training materials for the Navy Family Resilience Initiative when the doorbell rang. It was 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, an unusual time for unexpected visitors, and Jackson was at the base, finishing up a briefing with his commanding officer. Through the window, I could see a familiar figure standing on our front porch, but it took me a moment to process who it was. Vanessa, but not the Vanessa I'd known my entire life. This version of my sister looked smaller somehow, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual attention-seeking outfits. No makeup, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and most shocking of all, she was alone. No Tyler, no dramatic entrance, no audience for whatever performance she was planning. I opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain engaged. "Vanessa, what are you doing here?" "I know I should have called," she said, and her voice was different too. Quiet, uncertain, lacking the sharp edge of entitlement I'd grown accustomed to. "I know Jackson said all contact should go through him, but I needed to talk to you. Just you." "Tyler?" "He's with Mom. They're in family counseling together. All of them. Dad, too." She shifted nervously from foot to foot. "I've been going separately for 8 weeks now. Individual therapy." That caught my attention. In our family, therapy had always been treated as something for weak people or those who couldn't handle their problems. The fact that Vanessa was not only in counseling, but admitting it voluntarily, was unprecedented. "What do you want, Vanessa?" "I want to apologize," she said simply. "Not the kind of apology that asks for forgiveness or expects things to go back to normal. The kind that acknowledges damage and takes responsibility without expecting anything in return." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or performance, but found none. This felt genuine in a way that nothing from my sister had felt in decades. "Come in," I said, disengaging the chain, "but I need to call Jackson and let him know you're here." "Of course," she said, stepping inside with the careful movements of someone entering sacred space. "I wouldn't expect you to handle this alone anymore." I sent Jackson a quick text explaining the situation and got an immediate response. "On my way home, keep conversation general until I get there. You don't have to protect her feelings anymore." Vanessa sat on the edge of our couch like she was afraid to make herself comfortable, looking around our living room with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "Your house is beautiful," she said quietly. "It feels peaceful." "Thank you." I remained standing, not quite ready to settle into casual conversation. "Elena, I know you don't owe me anything. I know I destroyed something that can't be repaired. But I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you. Not just at your birthday, but for years, decades." She reached into her purse and pulled out a notebook, worn and filled with handwriting. "Dr. Patterson, my therapist. She had me write down every memory I could think of, where I treated you badly. Every time I made you the villain in my story. Every time I used you as a target when I was upset about something else." "Vanessa." "Please," she said, and there was desperation in her voice. "Please let me say this. I've been carrying it for months, and if I don't get it out now, I might never have the courage again." I nodded for her to continue. "The list is 67 pages long," she said, holding up the notebook. 67 pages of times I hurt you deliberately and you just took it. You absorbed it and came back for more, and I convinced myself that meant it didn't really hurt you." She opened to a random page and read, "Elena's college graduation party. I showed up drunk with Marcus, even though she'd asked me not to bring him because he'd been inappropriate with her friends before. When he started a fight with her roommate's boyfriend, I blamed Elena for inviting, quote, the wrong kind of people, and made her apologize to our relatives for creating drama. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I'd forgotten about that night, or maybe I'd trained myself not to think about it. Or this one, she continued, flipping pages. Elena's engagement party to David. I told him I'd seen her with another man at a coffee shop, knowing it was just her study group, but making it sound suspicious. When their relationship fell apart because he couldn't trust her, I told everyone Elena was, quote, too proud to work things out. Instead of admitting I deliberately sabotaged her happiness because I was jealous. Why? I asked, my voice barely audible. Why would you do that? Vanessa closed the notebook and looked at me directly. Because you were everything I wanted to be and could never become. You were smart without trying, kind without expecting anything back, strong without needing to prove it. You had this quiet confidence that I envied so much it made me physically sick sometimes. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. And because Mom and Dad taught me that tearing you down was easier than building myself up, they taught me that your pain was acceptable collateral damage for my happiness. They taught you that, or you learned it? Both, she admitted. They modeled it, and I perfected it. I turned destroying your self-worth into an art form, because it was the only way I could feel superior to someone who was naturally better than me at everything that mattered. The honesty was brutal and unexpected. Vanessa, I was never... Yes, you were, she interrupted gently. You were kinder, smarter, more responsible, more loyal. You were the daughter they should have been proud of, but instead they taught me to resent you for making me look bad by comparison. Jackson's car pulled into the driveway, and I felt a wave of relief. Having him here would help me maintain perspective and avoid falling back into old patterns of making excuses for family behavior. That's Jackson, I said. I know. I was hoping to talk to him too if he'll let me. About what? About the fact that he saved you from us. About the fact that I spent years mocking a man who was willing to cross the world to protect his wife, while I was married to someone who wouldn't cross the street to buy me coffee. She paused. Tyler's father left when the military family story went viral, said he didn't want to be associated with our quote-quote drama. I'm sorry. Don't be, she said with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in years. It was the best thing that could have happened. It forced me to look at the pattern of men I choose and the way I've been teaching Tyler to treat women. Jackson walked through the front door with the controlled awareness he always displayed when entering potentially volatile situations. He assessed the scene quickly, Vanessa sitting peacefully, me standing but not distressed, no signs of conflict or manipulation. Lieutenant Thorne, Vanessa said, standing up respectfully, thank you for letting me come here. I'm not sure I had much choice in the matter, he replied diplomatically, but I appreciate your directness in approaching this conversation. I wanted to tell you both that I'm moving, she said, and this was news to me. Tyler and I are relocating to Portland. I got accepted into a nursing program there, and Mom found us a small apartment near the campus. That's good, I said, meaning it. A fresh start might be exactly what you both need. It is. But before I go, I needed to tell you that everything you said about us, about me, was true. I was teaching Tyler to disrespect military service because I was jealous of your marriage. I was undermining your relationship because I couldn't stand that you'd found someone who actually protected you instead of using you. She looked directly at Jackson. I called you absent and questioned your commitment because I knew that any man who really loved Elena would never treat her the way my family treated her. And I was terrified that if she realized how much better she deserved, she'd never come back to being our emotional punching bag. And now? Jackson asked. Now I hope she never comes back to that, Vanessa said firmly. Now I hope you keep protecting her from people like the person I was. Now I hope Tyler grows up to be the kind of man who defends the people he loves instead of tearing them down. She picked up her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is a letter for Tyler to read when he's older, explaining why we moved away from family and why it was necessary for both of us to learn how to be better people. I wanted you to have a copy in case something happens to me and he has questions about why his family relationships are complicated. I took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. I don't expect forgiveness, Vanessa continued. I don't expect a relationship. I don't even expect you to think about me after I leave tonight. But I needed you to know that I understand what I did, I'm genuinely sorry for the damage I caused, and I'm working every day to make sure Tyler doesn't learn to treat people the way I treated you. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Elena? That night at your birthday dinner, when you asked me to take Tyler outside because he was disrupting other people's meals? Yes? You weren't being too sensitive. You were asking for basic consideration, and I should have said yes immediately. I should have been proud to have a sister who cared about other people's comfort. Instead, I made you feel guilty for having reasonable expectations. She opened the front door, then looked back one more time. Thank you for showing me what healthy boundaries look like. Thank you for teaching Tyler that there are consequences for treating people badly. And thank you for finding someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. And then she was gone, leaving Jackson and me standing in our living room processing what had just happened. That, Jackson said after a long moment, was not what I expected. She's really changing, I said, looking at the envelope in my hands. This wasn't performance or manipulation. She genuinely understands what she did wrong. And how does that make you feel? I considered the question carefully. Sad for the relationship we never had. Proud of her for doing the work to change. And grateful that she's moving away so I don't have to navigate a relationship with someone who's still learning how to treat me well. No guilt about not offering her another chance? No, I said, surprising myself with the certainty. People can change and grow and become better without me being responsible for managing their transformation, or accepting the risk of them reverting to old patterns. Jackson pulled me into his arms. That, Mrs. Thorne, is what healthy boundaries sound like. I learned from the best, I said, settling into the safety of his embrace. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone who's hurt you is the space to become better without the pressure of proving it to you. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to wish them well from a safe distance. 1 year later, I stood at the podium of the Norfolk Naval Base Auditorium, looking out at 300 military spouses from across the eastern seaboard. They'd come to hear about the Family Resilience Initiative, but more specifically, they'd come to hear from the woman whose ruined birthday had accidentally sparked a revolution in military family support services. A year ago, I began, my voice steady and clear, I was sitting alone in a restaurant on my 30th birthday, surrounded by cake crumbs and empty chairs, wondering if maybe my family was right. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was asking for too much. Maybe this was just what love looked like in my family. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. In the front row, I could see Jackson in his dress blues, his expression filled with pride and something deeper, the satisfaction of watching someone he loved finally understand their own worth. What I know now is that I wasn't too sensitive. I was appropriately sensitive to being treated badly. I wasn't asking for too much. I was asking for basic human respect. And what I was experiencing wasn't love. It was conditioning designed to make me accept unacceptable behavior. A hand raised in the middle section. I nodded for the question. Mrs. Thorne, how do you respond to family members who say you're choosing your military spouse over your blood family? It was a question I'd heard variations of dozens of times over the past year, and my answer had evolved through trial and experience. I tell them they're absolutely right, I said, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. I am choosing my military spouse over my blood family. I'm choosing the person who protects me over the people who hurt me. I'm choosing the person who supports my growth over the people who benefit from my diminishment. I'm choosing the person who sees my worth over the people who need me to feel worthless. The murmur turned to scattered applause, then built to something stronger. Blood doesn't create obligation to accept abuse, I continued. Family isn't about shared genetics, it's about shared values. And the most important value is protecting the people you love from harm, even when that harm comes from other family members. Another hand raised. What about guilt? How do you handle feeling guilty for setting boundaries with family? I learned to ask myself a different question, I replied. Instead of, why do I feel guilty for setting boundaries, I learned to ask, why do they feel entitled to cross them? Instead of, am I being too harsh? I learned to ask, why are they making me responsible for managing their emotions? Instead of, what if they never forgive me? I learned to ask, what if I forgive myself for putting my well-being first? A woman in the back raised her hand. Mrs. Thorne, my mother-in-law tells my children that Daddy doesn't really love them because he's always gone. How do I handle that? You handle it by understanding that anyone who deliberately damages a child's relationship with their military parent is not safe to be around your children, regardless of their title or blood relationship, I said firmly. Your job isn't to maintain family peace. Your job is to protect your children from people who would use them as weapons against your marriage. The applause was immediate and sustained. These women understood exactly what I was talking about because they'd lived it. The most important thing I want you to understand, I said as the applause died down, is that you get to choose your family. Yes, you're born into one, but you get to decide which relationships deserve your energy, your presence, your emotional investment. I gestured to where Jackson sat, and he smiled that quiet smile that had first made me fall in love with him 3 years ago at a Navy charity gala. I chose to marry a man who sees protecting me as part of his mission. I chose to surround myself with military families who understand loyalty, sacrifice, and honor. I chose to build a life with people who support military service instead of undermining it. And I chose to stop participating in relationships that required me to make myself smaller, to keep other people comfortable. As I wrapped up the presentation and moved to the question and answer session, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The Navy Family Resilience Initiative had been implemented across all branches of the military. I'd traveled to 37 bases, spoken to thousands of military spouses, and consulted on policy changes that were already showing measurable improvements in military family stability. But more importantly, I'd learned what it felt like to live without constantly managing other people's emotions or accepting blame for their behavior. After the presentation, as Jackson and I walked to the officers' club for the reception, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I glanced at it and stopped walking. Saw your presentation online. Proud of who you've become. Tyler asks about you sometimes. I tell him you're helping other families be stronger. Hope that's okay. Manish V. I showed the message to Jackson, who read it and nodded thoughtfully. How does that make you feel? He asked. Peaceful, I said, surprising myself. A year ago, getting a text from Vanessa would have sent me into an anxiety spiral. Now it just feels like information. She's doing well. Tyler thinks about me sometimes, and that's nice, but it doesn't change anything about my life. That's what emotional freedom looks like, Jackson said, taking my hand as we continued walking, when other people's actions become information instead of emergencies. At the reception, I was approached by dozens of military spouses, sharing their own stories, their own victories, their own struggles with toxic family dynamics. But what struck me most was the confidence in their voices, the way they talked about setting boundaries and enforcing consequences without the guilt and self-doubt I'd carried for years. You gave us permission, one woman told me, permission to protect our marriages from people who didn't deserve access to them. You didn't need my permission, I replied. You just needed to see someone else doing it successfully. Later that evening, back in our hotel room, Jackson and I sat on the balcony overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. He was reading through feedback forms from the day's presentation, while I answered emails from military spouses requesting resources and support. Elena, he said, looking up from his papers, do you realize what you've accomplished? What do you mean? A year and a half ago, you were a woman who had been conditioned to accept emotional abuse as normal family behavior. Today, you're a woman who's teaching thousands of other people that they deserve better. You've taken your personal pain and transformed it into protection for military families across the country. I considered his words, looking out at the water where naval vessels moved silently through the darkness, carrying out missions I'd never fully understand but now had a deep appreciation for. I think about that night at Chez Laurent sometimes, I said, sitting alone with cake on the floor, feeling like maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was asking for too much. And now? Now I know I wasn't asking for too much. I was asking for the bare minimum. And when my family couldn't provide even that, you showed me I had other options. What options? I could choose people who valued me. I could build a family based on respect instead of obligation. I could stop accepting scraps and start requiring real love. Jackson reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing over my wedding ring in the gesture that had become our silent language of commitment and protection. "And what does real love look like?" he asked. "Real love looks like someone crossing the world to surprise you for your birthday. Real love looks like wearing your dress uniform to a family confrontation, because you want them to understand who they're dealing with. Real love looks like turning your wife's family dysfunction into a policy initiative, because you refuse to let other military families suffer in silence." I turned to face him fully. Real love looks like a Navy SEAL who sees protecting his wife's emotional well-being as seriously as any military mission. "And what does freedom look like?" he asked. I thought about my parents, still awkwardly navigating the boundaries I'd set, still learning to treat me with respect because the alternative was losing access to me entirely. I thought about Vanessa in Portland, building a new life and raising Tyler with different values than the ones that had nearly destroyed our family. I thought about the 3,000 military spouses who'd attended family resilience presentations, learning to protect their marriages from toxic relatives. Freedom looks like waking up every morning knowing that I'm not responsible for managing anyone else's emotions or accepting blame for their bad behavior. Freedom looks like having a family that supports my marriage instead of undermining it. Freedom looks like using my voice to help other people instead of losing it to keep peace with people who didn't deserve it. And what does the future look like? I smiled, thinking about the life we'd built together, the mission we'd created from our personal pain, the family we'd chosen based on values instead of genetics. The future looks like more military bases, more presentations, more families learning that they have choices. The future looks like Tyler growing up knowing that real men protect the people they love and real families support each other's dreams. The future looks like you and me, continuing to build something strong and protective and honest. I squeezed his hand. The future looks like never again sitting alone at a destroyed birthday party, because I finally learned the difference between family that hurts you and family that heals you. As we sat there in the peaceful darkness, I realized something profound. My family's cruelty hadn't broken me. It had revealed my strength. Their rejection hadn't diminished me. It had redirected me toward people who truly valued what I had to offer. And most importantly, their inability to love me well hadn't made me unlovable. It had simply freed me to find people who knew how to love me right. Sometimes the greatest gift a toxic family can give you is the motivation to build a better one. And sometimes the most profound victory isn't defeating the people who hurt you. It's outgrowing the need for their approval entirely. That night, I fell asleep not thinking about the family I'd lost, but grateful for the family I'd chosen. And for the first time in my life, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.